Thank you guys for coming. I'm Andrew Kope. Got introduced to Mark in this Games Institute, and he asked, if he'd give a talk. My background is coming from mobile gaming, so a small indie studio in London, Ontario. It's where I worked for a couple of years as an analyst and then the lead of their sort of business intelligence function. Most of my talk is going to be relevant to free-to-play mobile, but it kind of extends in principle to free-to-play for PC, all those free Steam games, all that sort of thing, as well as premium games on mobile too. So a lot of the same sort of things are going to apply generally. The motivation behind this talk is that in this institute I get the impression that most of the people here are interested in making fun games, games that look cool, that are enjoyable, that are awesome, but I mean, business intelligence is a business to be had here. So usually when you're making something, whether it's building a building or whatever it is, like making a piece of software or even making a game, somebody wants to get paid at the end of the day. So the topic is, well, that sounds really cool, man, but is it going to make any money? And I mean, I have an awful truth for everybody, which I'm sure you all know already, is that great games are not necessarily profitable games. And it's, a dagger in the heart of everybody who has their favorite, game from the 80s or 90s or something that nobody's heard about, that didn't make any money, but it's the best game ever, right? It's an awful truth, but there's some ways that I think that even during an early design phase, and an early kind of ideation or conception phase, you can identify factors which might predict later financial success or profitability, and hopefully also add in design elements that will improve those features. So, the statistic from this Design and Research Institute, Electronics Entertainment Design and Research, is that 4% of games that enter production are actually significantly profitable. And, of course, some fail between production and release. So of the ones that are released, only 20% are returning a significant profit. So even if we have, 5 people, 10 people in this room, and everybody's making their own game, the actually number of those that are going to be significantly profitable for somebody is pretty low. So that's a little bit scary. If you were to say, hey, I want to make a game, it's like, well, am I going to get return on that time? Am I going to get any return on that investment? Like, why not just work for IBM or Microsoft or something? Like, what's going on here? But more important question to me is, what is it about that 4% that makes them this special magical unicorn that actually turns out to be profitable? So what key factors or what sort of things that we could quantify or predict are actually having that effect? So I was at Mobile Game Forum last year, and there's this guy from an ad network who put this slide up, and he said, LTV minus user acquisition equals profit. Like, he'd gone up a hill and there was a burning bush and he'd carved this down on tablets. And he had the secret, like, as if nobody figured out that the money you get in minus the money you put out is your profit. So, I mean, take this with a grain of salt. So I'm saying math here in big air quotes. But the general idea here is to just sort of use this as a framework for working with the ideas through the talk. So the idea here is that we have monetization, so how much users are spending in your game, retention, how long those users are playing your game. So we can say stuff like, for a user who lasts 2 weeks in my game, they're going to spend this much money in week 3, if they happen to last that long. That sort of thing. So we can sort of balance these two factors. So monetization and retention are sort of combining to produce the actual income for an operating game. This is, again, based on mobile stuff, but you could do it for a PC game with free-to-play PC game with in-app purchases too. Similar idea. And then, of course, you're subtracting off that your user acquisition costs. So anything you're spending on advertising, any of that sort of stuff. I mean, I'm ignoring that you're paying your developers when you're paying for rent. Just that's overhead. That's a constant. And then there's a discounting attached to that user acquisition based on the virality of your game, which I'll get into a little bit later, some of the specifics of that. And these four sort of larger factors combine all together to produce your operating profit, which once you sort of get up and running is the thing you're sort of concerned with. You can imagine the money it takes to develop a game and release it is sort of a cost. It's a sunk cost. It's like you have to put in that as your wager. That's the ante to play the game of mobile dev. But then once you sort of get into the rounds of Hold'em, this is what we're really concerned with. So I like to start with the ugliest part first, it's user acquisition. It's a terrible thing for any of you who have dealt with ad networks, and virality, which is a cool thing. So I'm always blown away when people sort of point to these top grossing games on the App Store. So this I grabbed from iOS US last night. So Clash Royale, Mobile Strike, Game of War. The fact that these guys are doing TV spots is insane. So yes, they are raking in huge amounts of money. They are no doubt tons of in-app purchases happening, but the question is, and to always consider is, what is their actual profit margin? How much are they paying on average to get one of those new users per day? If they are getting in 100,000 new users a day because of all this advertising, are they paying $500,000 a day in advertising? It's very possible to pay $5 per user, $10 per user, $20 per user. So one thing that's very important to consider when you're talking about profitability of the game and your sort of user acquisition is understanding the margins between those things. So you might have a game that's making $5 per user, but they're paying $4 per user, versus one that's making $2 per user and they're only paying 50 cents. The margins are different. So that game that's making less money has a greater margin in that case. Just something to consider when you're looking at that. I'm assuming everyone here is pretty indie with all their game dev, like it's you and a couple guys. Once you get to the size of someplace like Big Blue Bubble or even Top 5, so I'm talking with like Glue Mobile, Supercell, King, these sort of dudes, you're dealing with big ad networks. I'll tell you right now, mobile advertising is a scary beast. It's out to get you. You know, if anyone's seen that movie about the Wall Street guys where they're betting against the market for that big housing crash, it's kind of like that, where they'll say, oh yeah, we'll take your money. Like, we're not going to tell you to not give us your money. Like, it's stupid, but we'll take it. Like, that's the kind of vibe here. It's like every man for himself, which is fair enough. It's a business just like any else, but it is something to consider. And unfortunately, there's huge amount of detail we could go into. That was user acquisition is something I had in some ways specialized in my previous role. So I could teach a class on it. It's a huge subject. But the biggest takeaway is whenever you're paying for users, however much you're paying, however much you can get them to show ads for, that sort of thing, negotiate with the ad networks, however good your ad creatives are, the biggest thing you want to do is make sure you're measuring the quality of the users that you're getting through these paid sources. So simple stuff like tracking them through a device ID, monitoring their in-game behavior, and whether you're getting actual return on them. So if you know that you're paying $5 for a user, probably want to make sure you're getting back something around $5 from that user. Otherwise, you're operating at a loss. The other thing that's really interesting about the sort of user acquisition is that there's this non-linear relationship that you have between the amount of users you're paying for and the amount of users that you'll sort of get for free or almost as a byproduct. So if nobody knows about your game at all, then you don't have any users. That's simple. If you pay to get 100,000 users, okay, now you paid maybe $1 for each of them, paid $100,000, but turns out 100,000 people have friends. Some of them write blogs, some of them do this. In any case, even though you've only paid for 100,000, maybe you're going to get 120,000 users playing your game after this. So there is, the more you start spending on this paid user acquisition, the more you get side effect benefits and this kind of organic growth factor attached to it. So this is why in my formula there I had user acquisition with the discounting factor of viral factors and organic growth. As you're paying for more users, you're ending up getting more users for free, which It's a very cool effect and hard to model, but it's there, and it's something you should consider when you're actually calculating your purchase. So it's all well and good. If you're king, if you're Supercell, if you're Machine Zone, you have millions and millions of dollars coming in every day. You can, pay for those sweet TV spots. You can get Arnold Schwarzenegger on the Super Bowl or whatever you want to do. You can do it. But the user acquisition for indie devs, which is relevant to this group more so, is hard. It's really hard. And a lot of people have written about this. It's, every indie gaming forum or talk or conference I've been to has always had something about how do I get more people playing my super awesome game that they'll just love if they could see it. I won't go too much into detail on this. There's a lot of resources around there. It boils down to a few kind of key recommendations. So one would be just the game design itself. How much viral sort of peer-to-peer user acquisition can you get just within the game? Candy Crush is my favorite example of this. How many people have been spammed by Candy Crush requests on Facebook at some point or another? Yeah, like most people. They are brilliant. I mean, they're evil, but brilliant. It's like a double-edged sword. But as much as it's annoying to get them, it works. So as much as you can have people who are players of your game enticing or inviting other people to start playing your game, the better off you are. And that's free. That's just completely free for you, just based on the design of your game. You can do other stuff like content marketing, so you can go to trade shows and show off your games, or you can go to PAX or whatever it is and show off your game and try and get people interested and get the kind of groundswell kind of guerrilla marketing stuff there. Again, it's hard to quantify that return on investment, and it's difficult to do sometimes if you just can't get there. The other thing which I've heard of people talk about is just sort of saying, here's my game, check it out, put it on your review site, getting some real buzz that way. It really only takes one person who's a big social media influencer to play your game and then start tweeting about it or doing YouTube videos or whatever it was. With my last job, some relative celebrity somewhere in South America picked up our game, so we had this huge number of, I think it was Brazilian users sort of come out of that. It's a sort of interesting thing where if one person can start promoting it, then they have a fan base of 100,000 or 500,000 people, then you're getting a lot of free advertising that way. So that kind of covers off the user acquisition viral factor part of how we can sort of quantify our operating profit. Flip side, the fun part is making the money. So monetization and retention. In a perfect world, we would have robots to do all of the hard work. We would have self-driving cars. You'd get your meal shipped into you on a conveyor belt every morning. This is my perfect world anyway. And in that world also, we could make a game without any concern for whether it'll make money. We only need to be worried about, is it fun? Does it look cool? Is it great to play? No ads, no paywalls, none of this premium content that I need to deprive from my loyal fan base. No. Just great user engagement. Money's also nice in the world we live in, so we need to think about how to actually monetize our users. So we're going to do two different things here. We're going to look at measuring engagement and then measuring monetization. So engagement is one of the less controversial things about how to measure it, strangely, even though to me it's actually a harder thing to quantify. How do you measure how much someone is engaged with a given piece of software? It's a weird question. There are a number of sort of proxy metrics, things you can look at. User sessions per day, session length, do they play every day of the week? Do they play every 7 days? Do people, how long are they retained for? What I find is the best way to quantify all of these things when you actually have a game released and are looking to sort of quantify how engaged are my users is to look at a retention curve. So I have in the past looked at things based on just simple KPIs, so key performance indicators like what's my 7-day retention, what's my 14-day, what's my 30-day. These are the things you hear talked about a lot. This is the information that any of the major game analytics companies are going to provide for you in their dashboards. However, I'd invite you to look at it more like this, where you can say, okay, well, day 0, day a user installs, of course, they've played your game, they installed it, they're retained today. And then look at day over day, what percentage of your users are retained as to that day. There is a division between the idea of something that's rolling or a sort of day N retention. So a rolling retention standpoint, if I come back on day 10, I'm going to treat that as though that user was retained from day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So he came back at any point, he's now been retained for all previous days, versus a day N retention where did they come back on day 3? Yes, no. Yes, then they were retained on day 3. No, then they weren't. Same thing with day 4, same thing with day 5, day 6. That's the sort of way that I prefer to look at it. It's a harder metric, it's harsher for your game. You want to show the other one to investors or your mom or whoever you want to show off to, but the day end retention is to me the more useful one. Did they play on that day since they installed the game? Yes. So we can quantify that fairly easily. User sessions, just did they log in that day? Combine that with a measurement of monetization. Now, like I said, this is something where people have argued a lot more. There's a lot more articles on Game Sutra about measuring monetization than there are about measuring retention, which is confusing to me because one seems more important than the other, but I guess CEOs and CTOs and CFOs and all these C-whatevers are more concerned with the money figure. There's a few different things I like to look at. So average day until first purchase. Strangely, with mobile games, you'll find people purchase early. It's like, I like this game. I'll throw $5 at it, make it more fun. There's this idea that people need to like really get used to your game and really get sucked in, and it takes like weeks to monetize. In almost all of my industry conversations, that hasn't been the case. It's usually like, yeah, it's cool. Here's $2. That's how I tend to play them too. There's about 1 million fun initialisms and acronyms that could throw at you. Average revenue per user. So just how many users do you have? How much revenue is coming in? The quotient of that. Revenue per paying user. So take away everybody who doesn't spend, and just how much money on average are my users who do spend money spending in my game. Can combine that with a conversion rate to get average revenue per user. This is one that's relevant for this talk in particular. So average revenue per retained user. So on day 10, if the users were retained, how much money did those users get me? I'm going to ignore everyone who wasn't retained until day 10. But if you were, on average, even if you didn't spend any money, like spenders and non-spenders alike, how much money do the users who were retained that long bring in? And then there's this ugly one, ARPDAO. Has anyone heard of like average revenue per daily active user in their travels? No, it's, unless you're like sort of deep into game metrics, it doesn't really come up. It's one, so for a daily active user, like let's say I installed a game 6 months ago and I happen to sign on today. I'm part of the denominator of this equation, and anyone who pays is part of the numerator. So it's just the money I've got divided by how many active users came in today. It's useful for some sort of like financial calculations when you're talking about really quantifying your game company as a business, but I don't think it's that relevant as a metric for actually evaluating the quality of a game, because this is fleeting. If I acquire 100,000 users today, they're not going to all monetize immediately, so it's going to kill that metric. So I'd say ignore that if people start talking about their revenue per daily active user. Couple of other sort of metrics, which are, I'd say, more interesting. So from a game design perspective, what levels or milestones in the game are users spending money? Like, is it after they join their clan? Is it after they lose the boss level 3 times? Like, what is it that is associated with a user's spending behavior? And the other thing is, how long does it take a user to reach their kind of maximum lifetime value. You can imagine a game where it's a very short game, it's very interesting and exciting, but it's a dungeon crawler, and once you beat the dungeon, it's kind of over. So maybe everyone who's going to monetize in that game does so within 3 months. Whereas you have something that's more like a story game, something like this, where there's a long progression, or a puzzle game where there's hundreds and hundreds of levels that every once in a while there's this tough one you can't get past, and you're going to make an in-app purchase to get you a booster or something. How long it takes your users to monetize is a big factor, not only in terms of, oops, this is probably gonna, there we go. Not only in terms of affecting your cash position, like how quickly after I spend money to get users are they going to pay me back, but also saying like, okay, well, how quickly can I look at changes in my game in terms of how it's going to affect users? Okay, so a bunch of metrics I just threw at you. Apologies. I'm an analyst. It's what I do. The reason why I brought up this average revenue per retained user curve, and also in the previous slide, flipping back now, this retention per day, is that we can multiply these two together, and then we can sort of have now, on a given day since acquisition, how much money we're expecting to get from a user. So we can break these two sort of aspects of monetization of a user up into engagement and actual monetization, look at them independently, which is great. We can sort of figure out which is hurting. Is it my engagement? Is that what sucks? Are people dropping off really early? Is it my monetization? Like, they love the game, they're playing it, but they're just not spending. Like, figure out what's going on and involve them together to actually get your money you're making. Okay, so other sort of intersections of these two aspects of free-to-play games. So not every free-to-play game is done through in-app purchases. It's funny, there's this kind of ethical divide as to whether in-app purchases are evil and taking advantage of children versus ads, which are evil and taking advantage of people's time and forcing them to see this crap. But either way, there are ways to make money with your game. So in the case of an ad-based game, how can we show as many ads as possible without hurting our user engagement? So if we're saying a rewarded ad, like, we'll give you 10 coins if you watch this ad from Native X. Great. How do I make sure I don't kill my game balance now that I've carefully crafted and developed over the past 8 months by adding all sorts of in-game currency to the user? If we're forcing users to see ads, like, hey, I want to play this game, boop. Oh, I need to watch 30 seconds of a loud video ad first. Screw this game. iPhones get broken. How do we do that? Like, how do we make sure that we're showing as many ads as possible without also killing the user engagement? So that's an important factor where the two are sort of pulling against each other, user engagement and monetization. And the other thing with ads, in my experience, is the context around them. When someone loses the boss level for the 3rd time, probably don't want to show them an ad right then. That's, again, how iPhones get broken. But if they just beat a level, they just leveled up. Cool. Want to watch an ad to get a bonus item on your new character? Great, sure, I will do that. I'm happy right now. Yeah, that's all I have to say about ads. Another thing is paywalls versus long tails of monetization. Sort of touched on this before, where you can either make it very hard for a user to progress early on without making an app purchase. And a lot of games, I think EA gets kind of criticized for this, where it's like very, very strong motivation to try and make an in-app purchase versus, okay, we're going to make it not that hard, not that much of a paywall, not that big a bump to get over, but we're going to try and monetize you for a really long time. So how quickly you want to get the money back from a user is kind of key there. And then the other thing, which is sort of a fun twist on that idea, is the whale, where, again, big topic whenever you're talking about how to monetize games. How do I get more whales into my game? How do I, take advantage of these crazy guys with more money than God? This is where you have engagement and monetization working synergistically. So it's a whale, to me, is somebody who's really, really into your game. I would probably quantify as a whale for Pokemon Go. I think I've spent more money than I want to admit in a public setting on that game. I have played it since it was released in Canada day one, and I'm very highly engaged with it. I play it every day. So this is where a highly engaged user who likes your game and can spend on it has the ability to. So the idea of saying, okay, I need to get $1 out of every player is not as great as saying, well, if you can't spend, if you're not that into it, you're not going to. But for those users who really like my game, who are going to play it for a long time, let me make sure to give them the opportunity to pay me for my product. Like, let them eat fish kind of thing. So this is an interesting idea here, and a lot of people are always talking about how to get more whales into the game, as if like there are these guys sort of bumbling around that will just throw $100 at every app they download. I don't think that's the case. I don't do that with every game I play. For me, it's a great synergy between a highly engaged user will then be highly profitable for the game developer. Okay. Oops. So, gone over all this stuff, throwing a lot of metrics at you, shown you some graphs. I like graphs. That's all great, Andrew, but how do I predict based on my concept, based on my prototype, based on whatever I have to show right now, whether it's going to be profitable? I can't do that, but I can go over some factors which, in my experience, in my belief, do affect profitability. So 4 of them go over are the sort of genre of the game and the game mechanics, and these are of course tied closely together. You're not going to have a puzzle game with like world builder elements typically. They kind of go together, but I've separated them out. The creative content, which is more important than you might think in a particular case, and the advertising strategy, which is a little bit of a rehashing of some of the stuff we went over earlier. Of course, there are many more. I'm not going to be so bold as to say these 4 are the axiomatic and atomic aspects of a game, but they're the 4 that I have time to talk about. So, genre. Anyone played Dark Souls? A few people? Yeah. I have not played it. I was scared when my friends told me about it. It's like, I don't like losing that much, so I'm going to stay away. Genre affects a few different things. It affects user expectations. So, am I expecting to get just hammered over and over again by these NPCs? Do I expect to have a light, easygoing sort of, Candyland style experience? How is that going to affect my user expectations? So, from what I hear, I don't unfortunately have any personal experience looking in data to support this, but casual games tend to monetize users lightly. It's a few dollars here and there. Core games are going to have lower conversion, but the users who you do monetize are going to monetize quite well. They're dedicated. They're the guys who min-max every aspect of their character. They play the game every day, 6 hours when they get home, that kind of thing. How often and how long users play, again, that's going to affect your ability to show them ads, your ability to monetize them, and the sort of organic growth of the game. If your buddies are all playing a game every day, chances are you might pick it up. Size of your user base is a big factor here. If you really love hardcore dungeon crawlers, not everybody is like you. In fact, most people are not. So if you want to make one, and that is your dream, understand that you're now limiting the size of your possible user base from the get-go. Like, you've made the perfect dungeon crawler. There aren't that many people who are going to want to play it. Versus the next Match 3 title, Candy Crush, whatever, Toy Blast, whatever this game is, obviously going to have a lot wider reach. It's because they're not as hard to play, not as specific a sort of game genre. And these two actually kind of go hand in hand. If you show an ad to 1 million people, and half of that 1 million people, so 500,000 people, might be interested in your product, that's not bad. You're going to have some interest there. If you show your ad to 1 million people and 10,000 of those people might be interested in your product, way worse return on that ad spend, so therefore way higher user acquisition cost when you think about showing an ad and how it relates to getting a user back into your game. So, tied closely to the genre are game mechanics. Like, is there anything in the game that lends itself well to the viral component? So, talked earlier about Candy Crush and how it, ask your friends for help. Okay, now this one user has generated me 3 extra users for free. Game mechanics, they lend themselves to in-app purchase versus ads. Something that's kind of episodic, like a puzzle game where you complete something and then there's a nice break in context. That lends itself very well to a video ad. Whereas something that's like, oh, I'm like running through this dungeon and I'm really immersed in my character and oh shit, there's a video ad, like not gonna work very well. Versus, I'm building my guy, I'm optimizing, I'm min-maxing, I need one more gem to get the super axe of murdering everyone. That's a great in-app purchase opportunity. Like, you've made a user value something in your game very highly, and when a person values something, they're typically willing to buy it. User-initiated versus forced ads. Again, does that fit well with the mechanics? I typically recommend user-initiated as much as possible, though you're going to have fewer impressions. And like I said, casual core, hardcore, what's the user behavior going to look like? How much are they going to play? That sort of thing. Okay, creative content. So generally, doesn't matter too much in my opinion. You can have an issue when your game is so awesome, so high performance, that only an iPhone 7 can run it. You're limiting your user base right there. You'd be amazed how many people still run iPhone 5, 4S, whatever, just these kind of models from 4 or 5 years ago, especially in other countries. So North America, cool. What if you want to have a market in India or South America? They don't have the same phones that we do. That's just a fact. So think about if you have a very, internet-heavy game, graphics-heavy game, whatever it is, whatever the thing you want to build is, how might that limit your market and therefore raise your UA cost and crush your potential size of your user base? Visual style, yes and no. Probably want to be congruent with the game genre, but beyond that, it doesn't really matter too much. But the real Goliath of creative content and how it affects game profitability is branded IP. PewDiePie's game is an okay game. I'm sure that if it didn't have his name attached to it, it would be just as fun to play, but I can guarantee that it would not be the commercial success that it is if he didn't have a YouTube channel with the millions of followers that he does, and if his game wasn't closely branded to his style and tailored to his user base. Like, there's so many examples of this where you have a good game and a great IP, and that makes a success. The Walking Dead games by Telltale, like all these sorts of things, like those are a lot more profitable than Telltale's original IPs. Wonder why? Well, it's because everybody watches Walking Dead every week. Number 2 game in iOS, US free games in terms of download right now is this kind of nonsense Trump game. Again, sure, it's a fair game, but wouldn't be up there if it didn't have Trump's face on it. So, this isn't typically possible for an indie studio, but when you're sort of working as a larger studio, if you can make deals with some kind of existing intellectual property brand or franchise, that can really help. It's not everything. If you make a shitty game, doesn't matter whose name you put on it, it's not going to do well, but it can really accelerate a good game. And of course, advertising. You gotta give Game of War their nod for the first mobile game with the Super Bowl spot. Like, this has become a meme or an icon in itself, this ad. Yeah, you can see how the relative scale of the logos for the app stores versus Miss Upton's trademarks. How you do your advertising, how much you have to spend. Like, not everybody can throw that kind of money around. But if you can get some kind of advertising that has its own virality factors associated with it, think of the Old Spice, dude on a horse kind of thing. Like, that can be amazing. That can really stretch a very limited UA budget, pretty far. Okay, so we're 4 minutes short. But in any case, I hope this has been somewhat interesting, food for thought. This is me. I shaved my head recently, so that's a new picture. If anybody has questions, they'd like to ask me follow-ups, or hey, Andrew, you said this thing, piqued my interest. That's my email. Feel free to shoot me an email. Happy to grab a beer or something. I'm new to town, so it's all good. But I think we have time for questions in the meantime. Cool. And they asked me to give anyone who wants to ask a question this mic. So, anybody? Sure.
I'm wondering about the kind of state now of analytic tools. So when you're looking at the success of an ad, do you have data about kind of, I'm thinking more like, obviously each ad that was successful you know because somebody clicked on it, but any kind of other metrics, I guess, like the statistics around if certain ads that occur at certain places in your game do better like later in the game as opposed to earlier on, sort of thing. So they may be in the same place in terms of mechanics, but a different level or whatever. That's kind of time spent, I guess, too. Yeah, no, I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
Speak to that, I guess. Yeah.
When it comes to analytics tools, sort of two camps. There's the pre-made, which if you're buying ads, the ad network will collect all those data for you. They'll tell you for every ad view in this particular other app, whether it's another game or a utility app, whether the user clicked on it, how many impressions the ad got, which countries they came from, did that user then go to the app store, did they then install? So you can get that sort of UA funnel from a third party. There are secondary tools for doing that. So Kachava is a big one. Tune is another big one. So they're special analytics companies that will aggregate across multiple ad networks. So there's something like 10 or 20 large-ish ad networks out there, and so they'll be able to hook in very easily with those ad networks and give you sort of summary stats about your ad across these different networks. How did it perform? How does it do in this country versus this other country? All of your ads across all your networks. And then if you want to get really homebrew, which is my experience, as works the best, is you can track it yourself. So typically these networks will have APIs that can fire off events whenever any kind of interaction happens with your ad, whether it's a show or a click. And then you can obviously track installs of your app yourself through your own SDK or your own in-app notifications and messaging to your analytics servers. So there's a ton of options for that. For indie guys, I would say pick a couple of bigger networks that have good analytics tools and just use those. They're about as good as stuff you can make yourself. But when you get the size of 20, 30, 50 people, then I would say it almost makes sense to build it in-house. And that's my own preference. There's this phrase, surgeons like to cut. It's the idea that if you know how to solve a problem a certain way, you're going to solve it that way. I know how to do the homebrew solution, so that's what I like to prefer. And then as far as the ad monetization in the game, again, it's a similar sort of idea. The networks will have information about the conversion rates on an ad display in your app, but it won't be typically specific to the exact place it was. You can customize that, so usually they'll be able to take in ancillary parameters around I guess they're usually just called placements. So you could just get as granular as you want. It's just a headache for you to try and figure out what placement like 112 means as opposed to 114 in your app. So yeah, lots of tools provided for you, so don't need to make your own just yet. Any other questions? No? Somewhat useful? Interesting, at least? Slightly entertaining? Okay. Very good. Well, thank you. for your time.